shockingly, we have conflicting messages coming out of the Trump administration. We saw this over and over and over again in the first administration. He would say something and his staff would say something else, or his cabinet would say something else, or his cabinet would say something and he would say something else. Happens all the time in the Trump administration, and it's happening again. Hegseth says he and Vance are on the same page despite VP's remark on U.S. troops in Ukraine. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth told reporters on Friday that the reality of U.S. troops in Ukraine is unlikely, but insisted that there was no daylight between himself and Vice President J.D. Vance. In a bilateral press conference with Polish Deputy Prime Minister and Defense Minister, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that name, so I'm not going to embarrass the people by screwing it up. Hegseth touched on the possibility of U.S. troops going into Ukraine. At first, he appeared to shut down the idea, but then he seemed to not take it entirely off the table. Hegseth added that he would never put constraints around what the President of the United States would be willing to negotiate with the sovereign leaders of both Russia and Ukraine. On Thursday, in an interview with the Wall Street Journal, Vance said, if you look at President Trump's approach to this, the range of options is extremely broad, and there are economic tools of leverage. There are, of course, military tools of leverage. There's a whole host of things that we could do. But fundamentally, I think the president wants to have a productive negotiation, both with Putin and with Zelensky. He later elaborated in a post on Twitter, which read in part, President Trump is the ultimate deal maker and will bring peace to the region by ending the war in Ukraine. Yada, 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 yada. So anyway, official position, we don't want troops in Ukraine. Fast forward to this. Trump officials pitch Zelensky on U.S. owning 50% of Ukraine's rare earth minerals. The Trump administration indicated U.S. troops could be deployed to provide security in connection with the minerals if there's a peace deal with Russia. The Trump administration has suggested to Ukraine that the United States be granted 50% ownership of the country's rare earth minerals and signaled an openness to deploying American troops there to guard them if there's a deal with Russia to end the war, according to 4 U.S. officials. Rather than pay for the minerals, the ownership agreement would be a way for Ukraine to reimburse the U.S. for the billions of dollars in weapons and support it provided to Kyiv since the war began in February 2022, 2 of the officials said. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent presented the proposal for the U.S. to own half of Ukraine's rare earth minerals to President Zelensky in a draft contract he brought to their meeting on Wednesday in Kyiv, according to 8 U.S. officials briefed on the meeting. The motherfuckers showed up with a contract and said, here, sign this. Zelensky declined to sign the document when Bessent presented it during their meeting, saying he needed to study it and consult others about it, the 8 U.S. officials briefed on the meeting said. So these peace negotiations that Trump said he could get done before he became president, failed to do so, then said he could get done within 24 hours and has failed to do so, include the following. No membership in NATO for Ukraine. No going back to the previous borders that had been in existence for years prior to Russia invading Crimea in 2014, and then more of Ukraine in the most recent years here. We're not going back to those borders. So in other words, Russia gets to keep at least a chunk of Ukraine in this whole deal. The United States needs to own 50% of the raw materials and minerals that are left over in Ukraine, and we're now going to put troops on the ground in Europe. From the no new wars president, from the isolationist president that wants us to draw back from all of that shit. Now, on top of potentially invading Panama, on top of potentially invading Greenland, on top of potentially invading Canada, on top of discussion of a soft invasion of Mexico, now we're talking about putting troops on the ground in Ukraine. This is the dumbest timeline ever.